Welcome back to the Lydia McGrew channel. I'm continuing today my series on how Jesus sounds in the Gospel of John. This is going to be a pretty detailed series, so if there's something that I don't address in one of these broadcasts and you're thinking, what about that? I'm probably going to get to it later. But if you just can't wait and you want all the details, check out The Eye of the Beholder, available for just $9.99 on Kindle. Or a little bit more if you want to get the paper version with the cool cover on it. So don't give up on the series if you don't hear your favorite concern or objection about how Jesus sounds in John. You'll probably hear it later on. Today I'm going to be talking about an attack on John's robust historicity based on his inclusion of two explicit claims to be God by Jesus in John. I think these are quite explicit. One is John 8:58, where Jesus says, "Before Abraham was, I am." The other is John 10:30, where Jesus says, "I and the Father are one." On both of these occasions, the crowds take up stones to stone him, and they're very clear that the reason they're doing it is because they think he's committed blasphemy by claiming equality with God. These incidents are not found in the Synoptic Gospels at all. Okay, they occur in places and at times that are not even described in the Synoptic Gospels. I just want to emphasize something here up front. If you hear any scholar saying, well, I think that those sayings in John are a loose paraphrase of different claims that Jesus made for himself in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, that is a misleading statement. It's just a misleading statement outright, because these are completely unique incidents in John. Whatever you may think about Jesus' claims for himself in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and how much they resemble or don't resemble these two sayings in John, these incidents aren't anywhere there. So if John read or heard or remembered, say, the incident where Jesus claims to be able to forgive sins, or the incident where he says to the high priest, when the high priest says, "Tell us if you're the Christ, the Son of the Blessed," and Jesus says, "I am, and you will see the Son of Man coming in power," and that is recorded in Mark. If John was just inspired by that in a sense and said, "Oh, I'm going to make up something that's sort of similar to that," and then he makes up these incidents where Jesus is speaking to a crowd, he's out there free, he's not before the high priest, he's not up in Galilee, and he has his dialogue with the crowd, and then he says these things, then that's invention. That's not paraphrase, because they're completely different incidents. So bear that in mind. Don't be taken in. Use your Bible knowledge to say, wait a minute, how can that be a paraphrase of the same thing in the Synoptics? Because the same thing, the same incident doesn't happen in the Synoptics. So that's just something to bear in mind. Okay, so these are unique to John, and that gets used against John. Very common. The first way of using this against John is what I might call the Bart Ehrman method. Bart Ehrman is very fond of just pushing an argument from silence very hard here, just straightforwardly. If Jesus ever really said this, surely, and he'll make a big emphasis, surely it would be recorded in Matthew, Mark, or Luke. That is just a blatant argument from silence, and it's of a kind that we find to be faulty in history again and again. Things that you might think, surely this person would mention, like I like to mention Ulysses S. Grant's memoirs, not mentioning the Emancipation Proclamation, and it just doesn't get mentioned. So the proper response to that by Bart Ehrman is say, no, it's not surely at all. We do not need to assume that Matthew and Mark and Luke are all sitting down and saying to themselves, now, what is the strongest thing, the most explicit thing that Jesus ever said that indicated that he was God? I want to be sure to fit that in there. And then that they each thought of, the best things they could think of to put in there. And then either they never heard that he made any such statement as before Abraham was I am, which would be odd in particularly a disciple, if Matthew was a disciple, or that they heard of it but said, nah, I'm not going to include it for some reason because maybe they didn't think it was historical. Ehrman's really pushing this idea that they were trying as hard as they could to put the strongest case for Jesus' deity specifically. I find more of an emphasis in particularly Matthew and Mark on Jesus being the Messiah, and I'll be talking more about the distinction there, to argue that he was the Messiah. In fact, even in Peter's sermon in Acts 2, you find an emphasis on Jesus being sent from God, his being the one who was prophesied and so forth, but not right there an explicit declaration that he's God. So you can have different emphases. The other thing is, whatever your preferred view of how the Synoptic Gospels are related to one another and what dependencies there are there, it's pretty clear that their selection of material to report is not entirely independent. They sometimes do report unique events, sometimes unique details. I'm often emphasizing this. But at the same time, there's a lot of overlap in what events they report. That's why they're called the Synoptic Gospels. So, and they only had so much space in their scrolls. So if they're to some extent in some way following one another in what incidents to record, then they're not going to have as much room to fill up with unique incidents. John, in contrast, has lots of unique incidents. In fact, I'm of the opinion that he's in a sense negatively dependent, that he knows the Synoptic Gospels and that he's trying consciously to include things that were not already included. So then we would expect him to include sayings and events and so forth, including these that were not already covered. So I think we should just straight up reject the argument from silence there from Bart Ehrman. Now, there's a version of this attack on John's robust historicity that goes in a somewhat different direction. It's compatible with Bart's argument from silence, but it attempts to sort of bolster this and to go farther and claim Jesus would not have spoken as explicitly of his own deity as he does in John 8:58 and John 10:30. Okay, now that's a strong claim. And I want to recommend that anytime you hear somebody saying, oh, Jesus would not have said this, you should really question that, because if we have an apparent historical source saying that he did say it, then we want to be careful. It's sort of like with the cleansing of the temple. The claim, oh, the leaders would not have allowed Jesus to carry on his ministry if he'd already cleansed the temple. I mean, how can you be so sure of that? It's a very difficult claim to support. But here's how that argument goes. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we find Jesus repeatedly telling people, and sometimes telling demons, not to reveal certain things about him. So the demons will say, we know you're the Holy One, and they'll recognize that he's the Son of God, or they'll say he's the Christ, which means the Messiah, and he'll tell them, be quiet. When it's demons, you can maybe imagine that whatever Jesus wanted, he didn't want demons to be his, his announcers out there telling who he was. That is not the way he wanted the word to get out. But sometimes he tells people. And one of the strongest of these is in Matthew 16, where Peter says, you are the Christ, in other words, the Messiah. And Jesus tells the disciples not to tell anyone, it narrates, not to tell anyone that he was the Christ. So as this argument goes, it's sometimes spoken of as the Messianic Secret. If Jesus was so concerned that people not say that he was the Messiah, then so much the more, it's a so much the more argument, so much the more he would not explicitly have claimed to be God in these clear ways like he does in John 8:58 and 10:30. So it's this so much the more argument from his attempt to sort of squelch some people from going out and saying that he's the Messiah. Now there are a number of responses that people try to make, and I'm not inclined to emphasize some of the most popular responses. I would say the most popular response among evangelicals is just to kind of abandon John, which isn't really a response, but it's just to say, well, never mind, we're not going to try to support the claim that Jesus claimed to be God from those verses in John. We'll just sort of leave them in limbo. Sometimes they won't say that they're leaving them in limbo, but they just decide to turn their emphasis quietly and say, well, we have so much high Christology in the Synoptics, even in Mark, that's good enough. We're just going to go with that. Now, I think a major pitfall of that is a kind of an unspoken premise that we just don't want to bother defending John. And I think that's a very bad habit to get into. Don't get into that habit. And people will say, well, we're trying to use what is acknowledged by the liberal scholars, sort of like in the minimal facts case. I just think that's a terrible habit to get into, because in the end, it amounts to saying, gee, I haven't really decided exactly how to defend John because I haven't bothered. Okay? And it lends itself to a kind of an unspoken agreement that we just don't want to have to defend John. Okay, you can say that's psychological. What if that's not why I'm doing it? What if I'm really doing it to try to defend John? I once had an argument with a friend, a good friend, who had a premise that I just think is a very faulty premise. His premise was that if the claims to deity in the Synoptic Gospels are not just as strong as the claims to deity recorded in John, then this is a real strike against John. And so therefore we must, in a sense, defend the idea that John is redundant, that the claims to deity in Mark are just as clear and just as strong, and that's the only way we can defend John. Now, in a sense, that's lending yourself to the argument from silence. I mean, do we do this in ordinary life? Suppose only one person tells you about a car accident. Do you say, oh man, I'm going to doubt that car accident really happened because this is the only person telling me about it, and unless his claim is redundant, unless I have at least equally strong evidence for that car accident in some other way, I have to doubt him or question him. That is in itself an acceptance of the argument from silence, although I don't think he realized he was accepting that. John does not have to be redundant in order to be accurate. John is clearly not redundant in his report of, say, the raising of Lazarus. None of the other Gospels report the raising of Lazarus. So if you accept that premise that John has to be redundant in order to be trusted, then you're going to question the raising of Lazarus. And that's just a poor method. Sometimes one source is the only source that reports something. So we need to be careful not to make ourselves sort of desperate to claim that the claims of Jesus about his own deity in the Synoptics are just as strong, because, oh no, otherwise we're going to have to question John. That's a faulty premise. And it can lead to overhyping the things in the Synoptics. I think there are things in the Synoptics that are indirect claims to deity, but they're only indirect. So I actually endorse the argument for Jesus claiming to be God from his saying that he has the power to forgive sins early in Mark. But I also admit that that's indirect. I don't try to say it's just as explicit as John. It's not. It's indirect. I also think that it's not a good idea to argue from when Jesus is walking on the water and they're afraid. They think he's a ghost, and he says, "Don't be afraid, it is I," because that uses in the Greek ego eimi. He may or may not have been speaking Greek, but I think there he's just trying to calm them down. Like if you bump into your friend in the dark and he's like, "What?" and you say, "It's okay, it's me." Okay? No special theological reflection should be required for the disciples to be reassured. It's an immediate response on Jesus' part. "Calm down, it's okay, it's me." And I think that for him to say, "It's okay, I'm God," is not going to have that same sort of immediate, visceral, reassuring effect. So I think that's a poor argument. But people will insist on using it because of this, in a sense, desperation to make the Synoptic Gospels contain equally explicit claims to deity. And you don't want to put yourself in that position. I also think that it is not good to argue that whenever Jesus says he's the Son of Man, because that's an allusion to Daniel 9, that's equivalent to a claim to be God, at least as his audience understood it. I'll have more to say about this in a minute. But you'll notice that he claims to be the Son of Man, or he uses the term Son of Man for himself over and over again, and they don't pick up stones to stone him every time he uses the term Son of Man. So apparently in their minds, that's not equally offensive to these statements in John. So I don't think we should go that route of saying, well, John is redundant anyway because we have equivalent statements in Mark. I actually think there are implied claims to deity in the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and I endorse some of them. I endorse the place where the high priest says, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed?" And Jesus actually in Mark, it's ego eimi, "I am, and you shall see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power." Whether he was speaking in Aramaic or Greek, he seems to have said something like "I am," and the high priest rends his clothes. I think that's a pretty strong one. But I think that we have two extremely explicit claims in John, and they're not just made to a smaller group, they're made to the crowds. And we need to be ready to defend that, and just don't find that in the Synoptic Gospels. So I don't think that's the best response. Well, it's equivalent in the Synoptics. I would also note an irony here. Occasionally you will find the very same person giving at least some credence to that Messianic Secret Argument that Jesus would not have claimed so explicitly to be God, as in John, but then on another occasion saying, well, it comes to the same thing. It comes to the same thing. Jesus, it's just as good. It's just as strong, because Jesus makes such strong claims to deity in the Synoptics. Do you see the tension there? I think when the person does that, he doesn't realize that those don't fit together. Because if it's really just as explicit in the Synoptics, then what becomes of the argument that John is loosely paraphrasing, quote unquote, because Jesus wouldn't have been that explicit? Pick one. So I want to note that irony there. You can't have both of those. Okay, well, if that's not the best response to that Messianic Secret Argument, what do I think is a better response? I think a better response is actually to distinguish between the way that the people hearing Jesus would have heard and understood the claim to be the Messiah, and the way that they did hear the claims to be God that we find recorded in John. Now, I want to be really explicit and clear about this. If you are fond of, finding Jesus in the Old Testament, or interpreting Old Testament claims as foreshadowing the coming of Jesus, you may make arguments that the Old Testament really does teach that the one to come would be God. I think there are such arguments to be made. I think perhaps the strongest of these is in the prophecy that says his name shall be called, Wonderful Counselor, the Mighty God, the Mighty God. Okay? Hey, that's pretty clear. Some argue that the Danielic Son of Man in Daniel 9 appears to be taking on divine prerogatives. I'm less clear about how clear that was than some others are, but let's even suppose that that's what you might say the Holy Spirit intended by that passage, and that you think that in hindsight we can see that God did give his people hints and evidence that the Messiah, the one to come, would be God. Do not confuse that with the claim that the people who were hearing Jesus expected the Messiah to be God. Those are different claims. You can say maybe they should have expected him to be God. You can say there were indications in the Old Testament that he was God. You can say Daniel 9 is teaching that the Danielic Son of Man would have divine prerogatives. But I don't think the immediate audience of Jesus thought that. And I think we have clear evidence that they didn't. And here I think that I differ from Michael Heiser and from some other people you will hear who will just say that, there was an acceptance of multiple persons in the Godhead among Jesus' audience. I don't think they accepted that. I think their extremely negative reaction to Jesus' explicit claims to be God indicates they didn't accept that. I've already given one argument that Jesus multiple times refers to himself as the Son of Man, and in most of those cases, nobody claims he's committing blasphemy. The claim by the tearing of the clothes by the high priest is one of those, but I think Jesus may also have used the I am saying there, which, interpreted what he meant when he said you'll see the Son of Man coming with power. So that's one argument that they didn't view it that way. But I think perhaps the most knockdown argument is from John 10. So in John 10:24, you find the crowd saying to Jesus, "Why are you keeping us in suspense?" Look it up. "If you are the Messiah, tell us plainly." Now, to my ear, that does not sound like they're saying, if you want to blaspheme, go ahead and blaspheme, claim to be God. No, they want to know if he claims to be the Messiah. They are looking for the Messiah. Okay? They're hoping for the Messiah. They're wondering if he's the Messiah. Just as earlier in John, the religious leaders wonder if John the Baptist is the Messiah. I don't think they're thinking that if John the Baptist claims to be the Messiah, he's claiming to be God, much less that he would be blaspheming. They're making an honest inquiry. Do you claim to be the Messiah? Same thing in John 10:24. And then Jesus goes on and he talks to them, but it looks like it's the same crowd. You get to John 10:30 and he says, "I and the Father are one." Clear claim to be God, equal to God. At least that's how it sounds to me, and I think it really is. John 10:31, they take up stones to stone him. By John 10:33, they're answering Jesus. Jesus gets a little sarcastic with them. "Hey, for which of my good works are you stoning me?" And they said, "Not for a good work, but because you make yourself out to be God." John 10:33. Now, think about this just logically. If they thought claiming to be the Messiah was a claim to be God, why is there this tension? Why do they want him to claim to be the Messiah if that's what he's claiming? They want him to speak plainly, John 10:24. But they're furious when he claims to be God, John 10:30-33. It seems quite clear because they don't think the Messiah is going to be God. So, how does this help? Well, here's how I think it helps. I think for Jesus to try at times to suppress the claim that he was the Messiah, maybe to suppress that up to the triumphal entry, "Blessed is he that cometh, in the name of the Lord, hail to the Son of David," and all that, very end of his ministry. But to kind of keep quiet about the claim that he's the Messiah is not the same as his not announcing prior to that time that he is God. A clue to this is actually found in John. This is a point Craig Blomberg makes, that in a sense we have an undesigned coincidence that something happens in John 6 that helps to explain the so-called Messianic secret, because in John 6 they try to make him king by force. There was definitely an expectation that the Messiah would be an earthly king, to the point that they try to make him king by force in John 6. So Jesus wanted to avoid that. He wanted to avoid that misunderstanding of his mission. And for that reason, I think he did not spread abroad, especially in places like Galilee, where it was likely to be misunderstood. But I think to some extent, just in general, throughout his ministry, he didn't go around, hey, I'm the Messiah, hey, everybody, I'm the Messiah. Because he was concerned that it would be misunderstood. In contrast, when he claims to be God, nobody tries to make him king. They try to make him dead. They try to stone him to death. So I think that is the best answer, that claiming to be the Messiah would have been understood differently from claiming to be God. Now, there's one further criticism to this view I need to answer, which is that in John 4, when he's speaking to the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman, she says, when Messiah comes, he will teach us these things. The Samaritans actually had a messianic teaching as well, that there was one coming, and she uses the term Messias there, not Christos. But it was, Messiah. And he says, I who speak to you am he. So he clearly tells her that he's the Messiah. But I think that her very act of talking about the Messiah teaching them, and we also have some extra biblical evidence, shows that the Samaritan expectation of the Messiah may not have been equally militant, but was more of an expectation of a teacher. So I think that he considered it, in a sense, fine to tell the woman at the well that he was the Messiah. And in fact, that's borne out because they want him to stay and teach them. And they're really interested. They don't try to make him king, but they want to hear his teaching in the subsequent days. So if someone brings that up, that is answerable there. That, I think, is the best response to this Messianic secret argument. Now, sometimes you'll hear the I, before Abraham was I am, put in with other I am sayings, known as I am sayings with predicates, like I am the true vine. And I have not addressed claims that those are non-historical. I'll be talking about those in a later video, so wait for it if you want to hear more discussion of the I am claims with predicates. For now, I'm just trying to answer that argument from silence and that Messianic secret argument against the historicity of those clear claims to deity in John. So come back next time, and keep coming back. Be sure to like and subscribe to the Lydia McGrew channel. If you're interested, also check this out on the podcast. This particular broadcast won't be up quite yet, but there's all kinds of old content that has been loaded to that if you prefer to just listen to audio. Thanks for watching. I'm Lydia McGrew.